Oscar Piastri received a 10-second time penalty for colliding with Kimi Antonelli at turn 1 under the safety car restart. This, in turn, took out Charles Leclerc from the race, the poor soul, just minding his own business on the outside of the corner. But the question is, were the stewards correct in applying a 10-second time penalty here? Or was Oscar Piastri pretty hard done by? So let's start with the stewards' ruling and we'll break this down. Were they correct in the application of a 10-second time penalty? So they first state that on the safety car restart, Oscar Piastri attempted to overtake Kimi Antonelli on the inside of turn 1. In doing so, Piastri did not establish the required overlap prior to and at the apex, as his front axle was not alongside the mirror of car 12 as defined in the driving standards guidelines for overtaking on the inside of a corner. So the stewards are correct there that the racing guidelines do state that. It's nice to see them actually refer to the racing guidelines compared to what we saw in Mexico. Point A1, that is, where it states overtaking on the inside of a corner. I'm not going to repeat exactly what they said, but you can see it highlighted there on the screen. And, well, the question is, did the stewards get that application of this rule correct? Was Oscar Piastri, did he have his front axle, his front wheels alongside Kimi Antonelli's Mercedes before they got to the apex? Because at the apex here isn't necessarily the point that we're looking at. It's prior to the apex, because it has to be also at the apex. It's prior and to the apex. So let's have a look at that. And well, if you look at the onboard of Oscar Piastri and even some outboard shots, they are factually correct there. His front axle, his front wheels are just shy of Kimi Antonelli's rear view mirrors as he heads into the braking zone and in the actual braking zone into turn 1. So as per the racing guidelines, he's failed that first instance there of being required to be able to have that space on the inside through turn 1 as the overtaking car. Now, going back to the stewards' report, they state that Piastri locked the brakes as he attempted to avoid contact by slowing, but was unable to do so and made contact with Antonelli. This contact caused Antonelli to make secondary contact with Charles Leclerc, who was positioned on the outside and was forced to retire from the race as a result. Piastri was therefore wholly responsible for the collision. A 10-second time penalty and 2 penalty points are considered appropriate and consistent with recent precedents. So the stewards, while they don't put that in their stewards report, they're basically referring to item A2 here, which is be driven in a fully controlled manner, particularly from entry to apex, and not have dived in. And it's the driven in a controlled manner from entry to apex. So yes, he's locked up. That's undeniable. The issue I have is the reason as to why he locked up, which we'll get onto shortly. But the stewards have applied the rules correctly here, in my personal opinion, as they are written. Now, I have a disagreement with these racing guidelines. If anyone who's watched my videos will know I don't like these racing guidelines, but this is what the stewards have to apply the rules as they currently are written. And he locked up. He's out of control of his car prior to the apex, as point A2 states. And of course, he, in addition, hasn't achieved the first requirement, which is have his front axle at least alongside the mirror of the other car prior to and at the apex, even though it is only a slim margin. So while I give the stewards many criticism in the past, and while we all, I think, as racers and as fans of the sports, and even Charles Leclerc, who got taken out in this instance, see it all very differently, which we'll touch on in a second, the stewards can only do and apply the rules that they are given. And these guidelines, while they aren't necessarily mandatory because they're not regulations, this is what all the drivers and the teams have agreed to sign up to and how they go racing in current day F1. So yeah, the stewards actually did a good job in applying the rules as they are written here. But now let's get on to the discussion as to should Piastri have even received a penalty, because my answer is a big fat no. So why do I think Oscar Piastri is not at fault for this? Well, there's nuancy to this whole incident, which unfortunately the racing guidelines don't take into consideration, and the stewards arguably as well, because while I think they've applied the rules correctly, it does say many incidents require subjective judgment at the top in the very first line of the guidelines. And they are still that, they're guidelines. But what we saw was Oscar Piastri have a woe moment. And the best way that I describe this is that everyone has driven a road car. Everyone's been out on the road, and everyone's had at least a moment in their driving life where you are applying the brake pressure required to slow your vehicle down, and then something happens that causes the car ahead in front of you to stop a lot more sharply than you was expecting, and you then have to apply more brake pressure in that moment, and in some instances your tyres will lock and they slide across the road surface. Now, that's basically what Oscar Piastri had in this very moment. He was alongside Kimi Antonelli. In my personal opinion, I judge alongside when you have the front wheels overlapping the rear wheels of the car you're overtaking. I think that's more than sufficient, to be honest with you, and that's my issue with the racing guidelines and how they judge alongside to be. It's way too far up ahead of the car, in my personal opinion. But he was a lot further up, as we've already shown and have stated, just slightly below the required the required element to be required to have racing room on the inside into the apex. And he has seen Kimi Antonelli encroach into a space that he is preoccupying, and he's had a whoa moment, slammed on the brake even harder, applying more brake pressure, and has locked up and gone into the side of Kimi Antonelli as a result. Now, I hate the ahead at the apex rule. I hate the racing guidelines as they currently are. I've said that many a time on my live streams and just this channel in general. And while the stewards have applied the rules correctly as they're written, I think they've completely ignored the nuance here that Oscar Piastri didn't do anything wrong. In that instance, he's trying to avoid a collision. He had the overspeed on Kimi Antonelli. He had a right to have his car in that position and in that space. And then that space ahead of him was about to be preoccupied by another car who should have known that he was along his inside, which, looking at the footage back, I think Kimi would have known he was alongside him, because Oscar gets kind of, he starts to overlap that rear axle and get up alongside Kimi a lot sooner than I actually thought at the moment. I thought he was only really kind of up alongside Kimi when they kind of made that collision. But Kimi has all of that space to occupy over to his right hand side. Now, he's not entitled to use it. He isn't entitled to use it. But he should, really, for self-preservation reasons, know he has a car on his inside and that there's more space on his outside. Just looking straight ahead, considering Charles did slightly overlap him on the outside, then knowing that 100% that there's a car on your inside. So Kimi has gone to occupy an area that really wasn't his to occupy, in my personal viewpoint. And this is where I have an issue with these racing guidelines. And this is the problem with their head at the apex rule, because it just gives the car who is deemed to be ahead at the apex all of the power to do whatever they want. Now, of course, if you're on the inside and you get ahead of the apex, you have a lot more power than the guy on the outside, because you get to force the car off the racing track. We saw that with Max Verstappen back in Mexico, and we've seen it many times before. As long as you're able to keep your car on track and you're ahead at the apex, you can drive the other car on the outside off of the racing track. So if Oscar Piastri, as per the racing guidelines, had achieved that position of having his front axle alongside Antonelli's rear view mirrors, he could have done that. He could have driven him straight into Charles Leclerc, would have legitimately been able to do that because he had the power to do so. And Antonelli would have been at fault for that, for causing a collision, because he'd lost the corner. Just like Lewis was investigated for not leaving enough room to Max Verstappen back in Mexico, because he'd lost the corner in an instance because he wasn't ahead at the apex, and Max used him as a bunt stop and kept him kept inside the line. So that's neither here or there though with this actual incident. But on the outside, you then have the power to turn into the corner as you want. It's now your entitlement to for the car on the inside to back out. It's their job to back out. But as we saw here, that doesn't work at all when it comes to like racing, a dynamic racing process, especially when you've got a car who has his front axle like at your cockpit. Like his wheels are alongside Kimi Antonelli's cockpit. So if that isn't sufficiently alongside another car, I don't know what is, to be honest with you. And I don't think it should be right that a car on the outside is then just able to then come in and occupy the space, and that car on the inside just has to disappear. That's not how it works. Like, because then you get instances like this, and all we're going to end up doing is pushing drivers away from making these overtaking attempts, because Oscar was well within his right to go for that move, and I think he would have at least got his car on the inside and gone side by side with Kimi through that apex and through turn 1 and turn 2. Now, would he have held on to the position? We will never know. Personally, I don't think so, because Kimi would have been able to carry more speed being in the middle there. But of course, it would have been 3 wide, because Charles may have gone 3 wide through there, but we'll never know. We were removed of a brilliant sequence of wheel-to-wheel racing because of how Kimi, rightfully so, has used the racing guidelines. He's very fortunate he didn't end up with damage either. Not sure how he got collected by Oscar and also in turn collected Charles and ended up with no damage. Fair play to him. But these racing guidelines and how that's just been enforced is deterring racing drivers away from making these sort of moves. Oscar had the run. He was on the limit of the brakes there, and it was great car control until that space in front of him started to be occupied and he had that whoa moment. And we would have been rightfully so if he pulled that off, applauding it and talking about it all week, and how much of a momentous moment that would have been in the overall championship, because he would have been P2 behind Lando. Now, he probably wouldn't have caught Lando, but still, he's not losing as many points as he has done today, because he would have finished second. So I think these racing guidelines need a massive overhaul heading into 2026. There is rumours that is going to be the case. Carlos Sainz, who is the joint lead, or at least he's an influential role in the Grand Prix Drivers Association. Of course, the drivers are not to be completely blameless here. They agreed to these racing guidelines, but they have clearly, I think most of them, understood that they aren't suitable for how they want to go racing, although some have used them to their own advantage, of course, more than others. But in 2026, there is a talk about these being overhauled for next season, and I really hope that they are, because we want to see more late moves like that. Of course, if you do lock up and it was a move that Oscar had come from multiple cars back and just collected Antonelli, I'd be sitting here saying, yep, he's completely out of control of his car and he was rightfully deserving of a penalty there. But I don't think that was. I think, if anything, if you have, in my perfect world of racing, Kimi Antonelli gets a penalty there for turning into a car and occupying a space that he shouldn't have been occupying, and he should have known that Oscar was sufficiently alongside him. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. But I think Oscar is very hard done by there. He has been picked up at a two penalty points for his troubles. He has 8 on his license now in a 12-month period, so 4 more and he gets a race ban. So really, 1 red flag infringement, which we've seen Ollie Bearman pick up twice this year, which is 4 points. 1 red flag infringement and Oscar Piastri is bound for a race. That is how close he is. I don't know when those points actually get removed. Maybe they're sooner rather than later, some of them. But yeah, he is close to a race ban, arguably, right now, for something that I don't think he should have received a penalty for. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. It's a shame the guidelines are the issue. The stewards aren't actually the issue here, although they could have they do actually are able to take a different viewpoint of it. But technically speaking, they have applied the rules correctly as they are written. But they're still only guidelines. They're not regulations. So they are still really up for interpretation. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. It's a harsh one, and it's going to play potentially an important factor of him not winning a championship this year. We can talk about his performances as much as we like, but this incident in isolation, he was hard done by.